Russian literature has a bit of a marketing problem, right? Because pretty much every time people hear the words Russian novel, they tend to make a very specific assumption.
Immediately, they imagine this 1,400-page brick of a book that's entirely about depression. Something heavy, bleak, and honestly just incredibly intimidating to even pick up, let alone actually finish.
And we just assume it's written by a guy named something like Vladimir Konstantinovich Ivanovich Petrovich III. And hey, honestly, fair enough. Most of us see massive books like War and Peace and instantly just give up. But what if I told you there is one Russian novel that's actually short, surprisingly readable, philosophically insane, and literally helped shape modern nihilism? We're talking about Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. And honestly, it might just be the absolute best, most unexpected entry point into Russian literature ever written. Now, when we talk about Russian literature, we usually bring up two names, Fyodor Dostoyevsky and Leo Tolstoy, which makes complete sense. These guys are basically the Avengers of literature. But standing right beside them was somebody we weirdly tend to forget, and that's Ivan Turgenev. Unlike Dostoyevsky, who, let's be real, sometimes writes like a man having an active nervous breakdown, or Tolstoy, who casually writes books longer than human lifespans, Turgenev is cleaner. He's much more elegant and a lot more accessible. It's almost like Russian literature, but with the difficulty settings lowered just a bit. And what's truly fascinating about his masterpiece, Fathers and Sons, is its sheer physical brevity. It is a book that comes in at barely 200 pages, yet somehow it manages to pack in enough deep philosophy to mentally damage you for months afterward. Which, full disclosure, is exactly what happened to me. Because here's the weird thing. When I first read Fathers and Sons, I wasn't actually all that blown away. It felt, good, but not life-changing. Honestly, there were times that just felt like a smaller shadow of Tolstoy. But then something really strange happened. Months passed, and these random lines from the book just kept returning to me. It was like my brain completely refused to let go of them. When a catchy song gets stuck in your head? Imagine exactly that, but with existential philosophy. And eventually, I came to this terrifying realization. Over a 4-month delay, this little book had quietly and deeply rewired my brain. And then things got really crazy. A few weeks later, I was reading The Rebel by Albert Camus, and I stumbled on something truly mind-bending. Turgenev was actually the very first writer to popularize the word nihilism. Yeah, that nihilism. The whole nothing matters, no authority is real, life is completely meaningless, society is entirely fake thing. And the person introducing this massive philosophy in the novel is easily one of the most fascinating characters in all of Russian literature. His name is Bazarov. He actively calls himself a nihilist. He is someone who absolutely, cold-bloodedly rejects all authority. He rejects tradition. He completely rejects accepted truths. Basically, if society looks at something and says, "Hey, this matters," Bazarov instantly replies, "No, it doesn't." He operates on this incredibly strict philosophy where he truly believes that emotions are just a weakness. Romanticism is pure stupidity. Tradition is complete nonsense. And guys, this was revolutionary for the time. Turgenev wasn't just writing characters here. He was literally capturing an entire philosophical movement being born in real time. But then, Turgenev pulls off something purely genius. He actively breaks his own philosopher. Because despite all this cold, hard logic, Bazarov goes and falls in love. And suddenly, the guy who thought emotions were just irrational diseases becomes completely haunted by them. Which, if you think about it, is kind of hilarious. Imagine spending your entire life loudly proclaiming that love is fake, only to just instantly collapse the second a woman looks at you properly. That is exactly what happens to Bazarov. And what makes this so brilliant is that Turgenev doesn't defeat nihilism using clever arguments. He defeats it using human nature itself. Because no matter how aggressively logical Bazarov tries to be, he simply can't escape being human. And honestly, that's exactly what makes this book feel so incredibly modern to us today. Even now, people constantly try to become these hyper-rational versions of themselves, right? Emotionless, detached, thinking they're way too smart for feelings. But then life just hits them with love or death, grief, loneliness, and suddenly all that thick intellectual armor just shatters. There's this one specific line from the novel that completely destroyed me. It brilliantly captures his entire internal crisis. Bazarov says, quote, "The tiny space I occupy is so infinitely small in comparison with the rest of space. And the period of time in which it is my lot to live is so petty beside eternity."
End quote. And that right there feels like the absolute horrifying birthplace of modern existentialism. It's that crushing realization that human life is just tiny, it's temporary, it's almost invisible. And once you truly internalize that idea, you basically have two choices. You either collapse into despair or you start desperately searching for meaning. That specific tension between meaninglessness and meaning is basically the entire modern human condition. And Turgenev was already perfectly exploring it all the way back in the 1860s, which is just insane.
But what makes Fathers and Sons even smarter is that it doesn't leave us there. It gives us two completely opposite responses to life. On the flip side of Bazarov, we have his friend Arkady. He's young, he's emotional, he's undeniably human. And he slowly and very deliberately grows away from Bazarov's dark philosophy. He chooses to fall in love. He builds a future. He openly accepts life despite all of its uncertainty. And there's this unbelievably beautiful line when he proposes. He says, "He who hasn't seen such tears in the eyes of a beloved hasn't yet experienced the full degree of happiness a man can have on this earth." Which, to me, honestly feels like the ultimate, most beautiful rejection of nihilism possible. And you have to contrast Arkady's light with Bazarov, who just keeps spiraling deeper and deeper into himself, straight into the cold and the dark. Until eventually, when he's finally facing death, his lifelong indifference completely collapses. Suddenly, this philosophical giant who firmly believed in absolutely nothing is desperately begging for life. And it is such a cruel irony right at the center of the novel. The man who literally spent his entire life fiercely denying all meaning ends up clinging to existence harder than anyone else. When the end comes, he grasps for it the hardest. And honestly, guys, this is exactly why Russian literature feels so different from almost everything else out there. Whether you're reading White Nights, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, or Fathers and Sons, these books don't just tell you a story. They dissect people. They literally force you to confront parts of yourself that you normally try to ignore. Your fear, your love, your pride, the feeling of meaninglessness, and ultimately death. That's why reading Russian literature feels way less like normal entertainment and a lot more like undergoing psychological surgery. And somehow, against all odds, Turgenev manages to execute all of this in barely 200 pages, which, again, honestly makes absolutely zero sense. It is an utterly insane feat of writing to pack that much psychological depth into such a tiny physical space. So, look, most people avoid Russian literature because they just assume it's going to be too difficult, too long, way too intellectual. But honestly, Fathers and Sons might be the absolute perfect, most approachable place for you to start. It gives you everything great Russian literature is famous for: the deep philosophy, the psychological weight, the stunning writing, the inevitable existential crisis, but in a package that actually feels totally manageable. And the strangest part, like I said earlier, this book didn't even impress me immediately. It just waited, quietly. And then 4 months later, I woke up and realized I was still thinking about it. And honestly, that right there might be the truest sign of a genuinely great book.